Go right
All
ahead,
right.
Hirsch.
Okay, so this is lesson 4 of Heraldry 101, and we're going to be talking about a wide range of different types of charges that can be placed on your armory. I put a note, and it's in the slides as well. It's in the PowerPoint. It'll be in the notes online and all that. That the grouping of topics may seem a little odd. And basically, it was something that made sense at the time I was trying to lay out the classes and figure out what I was going to cover from one session to the next. And the only reason I state it's kind of odd is that in one aspect, you might think that since I'm doing the animate charges, I would throw the monsters in here. I'm going to do the monsters next week. And like you say, at the time I was putting everything together, it made sense. 2020 hindsight, yeah, I probably could have put the monsters in here and then put all the flora in the next lesson, but that's okay. So anyway, I just thought I'd mention that it was intentional at the time. If I was doing it over again and I was scheduling everything over again, I'd probably maybe change it a little bit, but that's okay. Okay, so the basics here. So myself, just real quick, I'm Hirsch von Henford. I'm the Gollum Herald, which is the guy who handles the awards list, the West Kingdom Herald's website, all of that good stuff. And I'm the Golden Stag Herald, which is a personal title. And this is basically, like I state, lesson 4 out of 6 because we can't do it all in one lesson. So, okay. So just a couple of things. These are aimed at SCA heraldry for both heralds and non-heralds. If you're interested and not part of that audience, although I don't know that we've actually had anybody that wasn't in the SCA in the lessons, there's no reason for you to not be here. I'm going to try to be fairly thorough, but I can't present every single possible thing that can be done with heraldry. It's just not possible. There's way too much. So I'm going to try to cover the important points, and I'm going to try to cover a lot of important points. And then in the case of the charges, I'm covering a lot of different types of charges, and I'm covering a lot of different types of animals and so on. But the important thing is there's always more. Okay, so it's just not possible to know it all. It's not possible to learn it all. The other part of this, there's going to be a lot of information. You're not expected to memorize this. I haven't. I'm always looking things up. I've got books on the shelf behind me. I'm always pulling stuff off the shelf and looking it up. I'll pop off to the web to look something up. You're not expected to memorize this stuff. I've been doing heraldry since very early on in my SCA career. You just can't. Okay, so don't worry about it. Don't try to memorize it. Maybe if you want to take notes, that's fine. But all of this is going to be available after the class. So usual stuff. Sarah's already turned off the microphones. Let me just click that. Sarah will keep an eye on chat, but chat has actually been really good with the current version of Zoom. It pops up on my screen. If you do have a question that you just feel that you've got to ask right now, we can deal with it. But otherwise, hang on to it, and we'll deal with it later. But I do feel like questions are important. I don't want to ignore somebody who has a question that's really important to them. Maybe you're considering a specific charge that we're talking about in class and you have a question about it, whatever. So I do feel like questions are important. I've been a teacher on and off for a good portion of my adult career. And I believe very strongly that that's an important aspect of learning. The way I think is not the way you think. And so it's kind of, so there you go. Anyway, so there we go. So the goals for today, we're going to look at a lot of the living creatures and trees, plants, flowers, and so on. Anything that's not considered to be inanimate other than monsters. We did cover humans and beasts in the previous lesson. Like I say, you can't put it all in one lesson. So there we go. Birds are going to be the largest category for this lesson, simply because birds are used a lot in heraldry. And so we're going to start there. So we're going to start off with birds. Now, birds cannot use the postures that are used for beasts. And that's because they have wings. And beasts generally have 4 legs rather than wings. So it's a very different way of dealing with the creatures. And so we're going to have to look at that. The wings can be in a variety of positions. There's four very specific postures, but we're going to look at wing positions. Most of those images on this slide and the next slide, actually, and the next slide is going to be all are from Eowyn Emberdrake's article. She wrote an article on heraldry for scribes, and so she's got these nice line drawings, really, of bird postures that are very useful for a scribe to lay out where the body angle would be for a specific posture, that kind of thing. So the standard postures for birds, these are the positions the birds are in. One of the most common ones is close, which is a bird standing with the wings close to the body. I do note that an owl close is also gardent, and we looked at gardent when we were looking at beasts in the previous lesson. It's the head facing the person who's looking at the arms. Other birds, by default, they face the same direction as the body, so just like you see in the first image that's on the screen. Displayed, which is also extremely common. The default for displayed is with the wings spread-eagled or the wings tips up, and the head is pointing to the dexterous side. You can have with the head facing the other direction. That would be too sinister, and you would just simply call it whatever bird type displayed to sinister, and that would change the position of the head. Okay. This is what is called the British default. So if you're looking at the difference between British and the rest of the continental European heraldry, there's a difference. So this is what is typically the continental version of a displayed eagle or bird or whatever, which is with the wings inverted. The wings are down rather than up. Okay, so displayed inverted. And then there's a term called migrant, which is actually an SCA invention. Some of the SCA inventions, if you've been on some of the other classes, some of them are no longer usable. This one is still usable. But this is literally, it's called migrating. It's displayed with the head and beak pointing up rather than to the side. Rising or rousant, basically we'll come back to rising again in a moment. This gives you the posture of the body and the legs, but the wing positions, there's 4 different wing positions that can be used for rising or rousant, and so we need to look at that. Okay, and rousant is used for swan, so anybody who's from Sinagua, that's an important thing. So volant is flying, which is typically bendwise. By default, it's in the direction of a bend, so it's at this angle that you can see on the screen. It can also be festwise, which would have the body horizontal across, and the wings can be up, and we'll take a look at wing positions again in a moment. Perched is a bird standing on an object. This image is from the SCA arms of Rohesia the Red, and it's a popinjay. We'll talk about different types of birds. This is actually a parrot. A fronty vert or green, perched and maintaining a hammer. So it's actually sitting on the hammer, okay, or standing on the hammer. So this is what perched is. There aren't a lot of examples in a lot of heraldry for that. And stooping, you see a lot of in SCA armory, but you don't see it as much in period armory. But it's literally a bird of prey swooping down on the prey itself. And so I used an SCA coat of arms for this because I could find an example of it. So, and we'll take a look at some more in just a moment. So those are the standard postures for birds, okay? So now, the wing positions. The wing positions are very commonly, well, I'm using commonly kind of wrong here, but basically when the bird is rising, or as I mentioned earlier, rousant, that's a very specific body posture, but then the wings, there's 4 different possible positions here. So there's elevated and endorsed, or you will often see in some books, you'll see endorsed and elevated. It's the same thing. You're just reversing the 2 words. The wings are up and they're close together to the back of the bird. Okay. There's inverted and endorsed, which is basically down. So it's basically very much like elevated and endorsed, except the wings are down, but they're also close to each other. So it's in a flying position. Okay. Elevated and displayed. So again, the wings are out in this case, but they're up. So the tips of the wings are up, and there's inverted and displayed, so the wings are down. The wing tips are down. So really, those are the 4 basic positions when you're dealing with with rising, but also in the previous slide. Boy, I'm doing good. It was not my grid, but it was. Wait, this is what I get for not following along on my notes here. It was volant, flying, the position of flying. A bird that is either rising or volant, which is flying, can use any of these four wing positions. And the rain just came back. Okay. So we'll see actual usage of these different wing positions in the standard source material that I'm going to be using. So you'll see images from Fox Davies and so on, which is one of the more standard sources. So with the eagle, this is the most common bird that you will see in most books on heraldry. If you see something that has a bird on it, I mean, there are some very specific birds, but this is the most common one that you will see. So you will see things like eagles displayed. And so you'll see two different versions here of a standard eagle displayed, which is, again, the British default and the continental default. And with the continental one, you actually have to define the position of the wings. If you simply say an eagle displayed, it's assumed to have the wings with the tips pointed up. Okay, if you want it the other way, you have to state displayed with the wings inverted or something, wings inverted. You don't necessarily use the word with. And there's an example from Fox Davies of a double-headed eagle here, which is not as common in British heraldry. You see it more in Germanic and some of those countries, but it does show up periodically in English heraldry as well. Now, an eagle close. So here's an eagle in the standing position, and this is kind of a default position for a lot of birds. So if you simply define a bird of a specific type and you don't give a posture, it's going to be assumed to be in the position of close, which is standing. Okay. Then we get an eagle rising, and this is what I was talking about with the different wing positions for rising. Okay, so an eagle rising, wings elevated and endorsed, an eagle rising, wings endorsed and inverted. And this is also where I'm talking about where the words sometimes get switched, so inverted and endorsed and so on. But it's the same basic thing. So the wings are either up or they're down, and they're close to the back, or they're actually really displayed. They're out to the sides of the bird. Okay, and this is very, again, with a swan, the term, rising is actually rousant, which is a combatant. For a swan, if you've ever dealt with a swan, you don't want to fight one of those. Anyway, on the right, I pulled an image from Neubecker because I'm trying to make sure I throw these in periodically. It's to show you that you can take a charge and you can use a field division to color it. Okay, so in this case, this is an eagle checky or in gules. Okay. And it's put on a blue field, which I assume is actually the one that's used for the actual device. It's hard to tell sometimes with Neubecker the way he pulls some of the images. But anyway, the image is from the arms of the Margraviat, something like that, of Moravia, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, I just want to throw out, and I throw this out periodically, is that you can use the field divisions and all those different things that you can do on charges specifically without doing them on the field. So anyway, so there you go. Now there's a lot of other types of birds besides eagles. The eagles are just the most common. So the next few slides are mostly Fox Davies. Some of them have some very unique and specific charges, and not charges, but postures. Boy, I'm doing good today. Wow. Here I am. I guess I psyched myself out from earlier. Anyway. But these are, so basically the big thing here is that with most of these birds, unless they're defined with a specific posture, again, they're going to be close, which is standing on one side, facing off to the other, and so on. So a falcon is the first one shown, and a falcon, there's not a lot of difference between a falcon and an eagle. It's minor differences, but there you go. You can also use other terms for the falcon. For canting purposes, hawk or falcon. Sometimes they're shown belled and jest, and this one actually, if you look at it closely, you'll see that there's actually bells on the leg that's closer to the viewer. The bells imply that there are jesses. Jesses are the ribbons that are used to tie the bells to the leg of a bird. Okay, so, but you can also simply have them jess with no bells. There's all kinds of fun little things. They make very minor difference if you're comparing two birds to each other, but they're still, some people like having that extra detail on their birds. So a pelican is often shown as a pelican in her piety. Basically, the other term that is sometimes used in heraldry is vaulting. It's cleaning its breast feathers. Now, the pelican has an interesting history, and we talked a little bit about the way some creatures are seen in period in the last lesson. Basically, the assumption here is that someone saw a pelican in the wild cleaning its breast feathers as if it was causing itself to bleed to feed the young in its nest. And you can always see when you see a pelican in her piety, there's birds in the nest, and it's always shown with blood drops coming off the chest of the pelican. This turned into a symbol of sacrifice, and it became one of the symbols of Christ. And if you look at a lot of medieval churches, sometimes in the decorations you will see a pelican in her piety, and that's why it's a symbol of sacrifice, giving your blood for your young, right? And within the SCA, it's used as a symbol for the Order of the Pelican. And you can use a pelican in any other posture except a pelican in her piety for your arms, because a pelican in her piety is reserved for the Order of the Pelican. So there you go. Okay. Now, an ostrich isn't shown very often in heraldry, but it is sometimes shown. When it is shown, it sometimes has a horseshoe in its mouth, and that's because there was this weird, again, the medieval mythology of animals. There was some exaggeration of its ability to eat anything. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Looney Tunes cartoons, but there were actually some Looney Tunes cartoons with ostriches eating everything in sight, eating boots and all kinds of stuff. It's really odd. So anyway, the dove typically has this little tuft on the back of its head, but you will often see a dove with an olive branch in its mouth or in its beak. And they were obviously used as a symbol of peace. And so that's where you even see this in modern artwork and so on. A dove is commonly used as a symbol of peace if it has the olive branch in its mouth. The whole term extending the olive branch comes from this exact concept right here. Okay. The martlet is a fun one because in the Middle Ages, it was assumed that a martlet had no feet, because it was never seen on the ground. It's a very strange concept in its own way, but there you go. But you can say the same thing of a hummingbird, right? You never see a hummingbird sitting on the ground. I have seen hummingbird feet, however. And the last one shows a martlet volant, although in this case it would actually be called volant fesswise, because again, the default would be bendwise, right? So within heraldry, you have to be fairly precise sometimes. So. Okay, so those are some of the birds that are possible, and here's a few more. Okay, so a swan close, and again, I mentioned earlier, if it is shown rising wings elevated and displayed, it is a swan rousant, and I believe the arms of Sinagua have a swan rousant. So I'd have to go back and look at this point. But anyway, but the swan is basically one of those things. And again, if you've ever been attacked by a swan, you don't want to do that. It's not fun. The cock is sometimes called a gamecock. It's a rooster. Obviously, if you look at it, it's a rooster, but within heraldry, it's called a cock. The comb and the wattles. The comb is the top, and the wattles are under the chin. Are a different color from the rest of the bird, whatever else is going on with the bird. A peacock in his pride is shown a fronty, with the tail feathers showing off. It's literally got the feathers up. It's out in mating season at this point. The default posture is facing, let me see here, facing dexter, wings close, and the tail downwards. And so that's a different posture. And unfortunately, Fox Davies doesn't show that one. You don't see it too often. It's easier to show the peacock in his pride. A lot of people, you will see that more often than you will see anything else. The peacock proper is mostly blue and green. with eyes in the tail, and it's considered to be a color for the purpose of the rule of tincture. So with a peacock, if you call it simply a peacock proper, or a peacock in his pride proper, then it would tend to be blue and green. Okay, so you couldn't put that on a red field. So now, there are some things, and I put this in the notes. The College of Arms a while back put in a very careful description of what the postures happen to be that are allowable for a peacock. And the reason for that is that peacocks, if you do them the wrong way, they're undefinable. They don't look like anything that anybody could recognize from a distance. So there are some very specific terms for how you lay out, you put the peacock on your shield if you decide to use one. They're in the notes if you're interested, and I'm not going to try to go over all the details because it would take a while, and I don't have a lot of images. So a crane in its vigilance, boy, that was in its vigilance, wow. English, I used to know English, is often shown holding a stone. So the idea is that if it fell asleep, it would wake itself up because it would drop the stone. Some interesting little mythology here. Again, the Middle Ages were an interesting time. A stork is often shown with a snake in its beak. So you see that one here. A heron. So we have three water birds, or birds that tend to spend a lot of time standing in the water here. There's not much difference in the appearance with a stork except for the appearance of the head. There has this little extra crest off the back of it. It's also often shown with an eel in its mouth as opposed to the snake that you see with a stork. So, and we'll talk about snakes and eels and so on in later parts of this lesson. So, okay, and just a few more. These are mostly from Fox Davies. You have a raven. These are very common in heraldry, both period and SCA. The harbinger, the black bird that goes out and cries in the night, or actually during the day. But there is no difference between a raven, a crow, or a rook. And sometimes people will use a rook for a very specific purpose. Again, canting arms for something that works with their last name or something like that. The Cornish chough is seen more often than the raven and so on, according to Fox Davies. I haven't seen it as much as I've seen the raven, but I've been mostly looking at SCA heraldry, so there you go. The big difference is that it's when it's blazoned proper, the beak and the legs tend to be gules or red. It is shown with the extra hairy bits coming off of it. I'm not quite sure what the purpose of those extra hairy bits are. I haven't found an explanation, although I'm sure that somebody who knows more about birds could tell you. So I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the position close that an owl, when it is close, is guardant by default. So if you have an owl close on your arms, you don't have to define it as being guardant. You can simply state it is an owl close. And by default, the head would be facing the person looking at the arms, which is very different from all the other birds. Okay. The parrot or popinjay, there isn't a whole lot to say. It is literally a parrot, and so it can be pretty much any color. There's no default tincture because parrots come in all kinds of different colors. So the moorcock is very much like a standard cock or a rooster, except that it tends to have two or more feathers at a right angle coming off the backside. I don't know why that's a specific thing, but there it is. There's a lot of stuff that I cannot find a lot of explanation for, so there you go. I do look, but I can't always find it. Now, I threw in a penguin partially because I've been working with the Baroness of Alicia recently, working on getting her arms registered. And she has two penguins on her arms, but anyway, a penguin you don't see a whole lot in period armory. It does show up in SCA armory. There's something like 50, 55 registrations to date. But I found one that was fairly simple to use as an example here. This is for a person, honest to God, this is their registered name, Penguin Shepherd. And they have a penguin with a shepherd's crook. So there you go. This is somebody in Lockhawk. I'm sure they thought this was hysterical. So there you go. Penguins can't fly, so they tend to be drawn as either close, which is what you're seeing here, or statant. So there isn't a whole lot else that you can do with them. So, okay. Now, when we look at birds, the other thing is that like a lot of the other stuff, when we were looking at beasts in the last lesson, you often will see parts, okay? So you'll see legs and you'll see tails and so on. So we're going to take a look at bird parts. So heads are very much like beast heads. They can use the same line for cutting off the head. So you'll have cooped, which is what is shown here with the eagle's head. You can have erased, which is the one that's torn off. If you were at the last lesson, then you've looked at the last lesson, you will see that that's an option as well. Legs, there's two versions of legs shown here. Both of them are a la cuisse, which is cut off at the thigh. And the first one is erased, which is, again, it's that torn off thing. And the other one is cooped. So just a couple of different examples of what that can look like. And a bird's foot tends to be cut off just below the joint of the leg, okay? And this one shows the foot bendwise, which places the foot in chief, as opposed to the other two. So, all right. Now, wings. Wings you will see a lot more of in heraldry because we also use wings on other creatures. We use them on inanimate charges and so on. So a single wing by default is the dexter wing. So if you were the bird, this would be its right wing. But you can also have a dexter wing or a sinister wing. You just have to define it. A pair of wings can be shown as a vole, which is two wings conjoined without the bird attached. You can also have two wings or a pair of wings conjoined in lure, which is with the wings down. So again, it's the up versus down posture. And I've got two different examples of the wings conjoined in lure, just because, again, artwork. Some people might like the one from Fox Davies. Some people might like the one from Bruce's website. So just different ways of drawing the exact same charge. A couple of Germanic charges that are shown here. This is a wing terminating in a hand. And interestingly, this first one, the wing is actually the hand is actually where the wing would be conjoined to the body on a bird. Where in the next one, actually no, let's see, is opposite from where the wing would. It's very hard to tell sometimes. It's opposite from where the wing would join the body, I guess. It's a little tricky with some of these. And the other one is basically kind of going a different direction. It's the same concept, but the hand is issuant from a different part of the wing. And it's just, it's Germanic. It's an interesting charge. And again, you might like that. It's not something I would necessarily want to use, but that's me, right? We're all different. So in the last example, I give you a simple example of an inanimate charge using wings. And this one is a tower that is winged, or winged tower. The idea being that you'll have wings on either side of the charge, except for winged shoes or winged feet, in which case they are attached near the ankle or the heel, which is kind of an interesting way of doing that. But if you think of Mercury's sandals and so on, they can be added to other creatures, and we'll be looking at monsters with wings and all of that good stuff when we get to monsters. Because that's a very common way to create a monster, is to add wings to a charge that doesn't normally have wings. Okay, now the last thing with bird parts is we have feathers. And feathers themselves can be used as charges. Within the Middle Ages or period armory, the default is ostrich feathers. Within SCA armory, it tends to be a goose feather or something very close to a goose feather. It's a simpler looking feather. They default to palewise, so if you simply state a feather, it's going to be vertical. It's going to have the point of the feather on the bottom. So the second one is a quill pen, and if you look at that, you'll see that a bunch of the feather itself is removed so that you have the shaft of the feather, and then the point itself is sharpened into a point, And this is where the term penknife comes from, is a knife specifically designed for this purpose. Okay? So if you've ever wondered why it's called a penknife, that's what it's called, why it's called that. And then the default feather in period armory is an ostrich feather. This is from the Shield of Peace for the Black Prince. That's Edward the Black Prince. It is sable, 3 feathers, and it has scrolls on each of the feathers with words on them. So, but you can have the ostrich feather by itself. So those, and that's just pretty much it for the birds. So the next thing that we want to look at, because there's all kinds of other types of creatures that you can do with armory, are fish. So most of the heraldic terms that are used for fish are very specific to fish, except for one called turgient, which we will look at. Turgient is used for some of the other creatures as well. So now, you'll also see as we go along that some of the creatures that are lumped in with fish aren't actually what we would tend to call fish. So now, we'll take a look at the dolphin in a later lesson. There's 2 different types of dolphin. There's the natural dolphin and the heraldic dolphin. The heraldic dolphin is a monster. We'll look at that when we get to the next lesson, which starts off with monsters. So now, weirdly enough, Fox Davies didn't, while he talks a little bit about fish, he doesn't actually have any pictures of fish. So it's just one of those oddities. So, okay, so the first example is a fish naiant, which is fess-wise. Okay, we have a fish horient, which is pale-wise with its head to chief. Now, the other, on the same image here, you will also see the chabot fish on the right, which is turgient, and that's a flatfish. A halibut or a chabot or something like that is a flatfish, and the only way to make it look like that fish, you have to look at it from above. So that's what turgient is looking at it from above. Urinant, which is basically, and I don't have a picture, Bruce didn't give a picture either, but it's literally take the fish that's horient and turn it upside down so that the head is down towards base. So it's basically swimming towards the bottom of the river, the lake, the ocean, whatever. And turgient is used with fish when you're dealing with a flatfish. So now, fish are often shown as embowed. So any of the fish that are shown here could be embowed. They would have a slight curve to their shape, and then you don't have to define that. Okay, now you can, but it's not required. It's an artistic detail. So, and the third image there is 3 fish threaded into a triangle. So just, you can see the way they overlap. Okay, and that's called threaded. So, okay, now some more on fish. So again, there's going to be some things that you probably don't think of as fish. So, but then we have a fish called a barbel. We have the dolphin in its natural heraldic, rather than a heraldic dolphin. So this is a natural dolphin naiant. And again, this is where we get that curve, the embowed part. Okay, you'll see that the dolphin there. We have a fish called a lucy or a pike. It's a very aggressive fish. It has teeth. And the name of the fish is used in heraldry based on the name of the family that's using it in some cases. So you will see a family that uses the name Lucy using this exact same fish as a pike, and so on. So it's one of those interesting things with heraldry, and that's what canting is all about. And I think I mentioned that in the last couple of lessons, is canting is you basing a charge off of your family name. Okay. This is a whale. It doesn't look a whole lot like a whale, but if you understand that a sailor coming to shore and telling a herald that it's this huge fish, well, what is a herald going to know about what a whale actually looks like if he's never seen one, right? And so this is what ended up happening here. If you want to, you can use a natural whale using a specific species, so you can use sperm whale or whatever. But if you just define whale, this could easily be what shows up on a scroll if you had that in your arms. Now, the narwhal is interesting because it tends to be shown as it is in nature. The point coming off the mouth there is actually a tooth, but because of its appearance, some people believe that there are people who use this as an example to show that unicorns were real because they found these on shore. And so people use this to state, yes, unicorn horn, here we go. Okay, so just a few more bits on sea creatures. So a natural seahorse as opposed to the heraldic seahorse, which again, we'll look at the heraldic seahorse in the next lesson. The eel, now we'll take a look at serpents later in this lesson. The big difference between an eel and a serpent is that it has a tail and fins, and so it can swim. Okay. For canting purposes, it might be called a conger. And a small eel can be called a grig. I've never seen anybody use the term grig, although it's possible. I haven't seen every single thing that's out there. So, a polypus is known outside of SCA heraldry as an octopus. We dealt with that in this way because they can be a little confusing, and so it was easier simply to call them a polypus. And I don't remember all the details. There was a change in the last, 20 some odd years in the College of Arms. But anyway, the tentacles should fill the field as much as possible. They shouldn't be overlapping each other. They shouldn't just be a jumble of legs or limbs all tied together in a knot or anything like that. If you simply state a polypus, the tentacles will be to base. Okay, if it's inverted, then the tentacles would be to the top. Related in appearance, but not really, all that close, is the calamari, which is a squid. And we use the term calamari once again just to avoid a lot of confusion. And weirdly enough, the tentacles default to chief if you simply state there's a calamari on the arms. It's actually considered to be a monster due to the association with the kraken, but I left it here because of the resemblance of to the polypus and just to show you the difference between the two without having to do it again in another slide or in another lesson. So the crab, oddly enough, is known for its irritability. If you were to show a crab sideways, it would be kind of hard to tell what it was. So it tends to default to being shown as turgid as seen from above. So that's the most common way you'll see a crab in heraldry. There's a lobster or crayfish. If you look at Bruce's website, and I always put the references in the notes and so on for these. If you go to Bruce's website, he goes into a lot of discussion about the difference between a lobster and a crayfish and a prawn. It's like, okay, that's a little more detail than I want to get into in my class, but there you go. So now with fish parts, it's really kind of tricky. I didn't use any sharks, by the way, Sarah, simply because I forgot. There are sharks actually registered as well. Sarah has a shark on her device, so thought I'd mention that. But fish parts are tricky. They don't seem to be used much in heraldry, mostly because the fish fin is kind of a triangle, and triangles are a specific charge in heraldry. So you don't really see a lot there. You don't see a lot of fish teeth and things like that. There is one registration for a shark's tooth, and that seems to be about it in the SCA. Now, you do sometimes see shells. Oddly enough, and this is one of the reasons that Fox Davies kind of throws me off sometimes, he puts the whelk shell under fish, but he puts the escallop, which is another shell, under inanimate objects. And it's one of those weird inconsistencies that I just don't quite get, but there you go. Things happen. It's, maybe he got tired. I don't know. It happens. Okay, so that's the fish. So, and again, there's always more types of fish. There's always different and so on. So if you didn't see something that you're particularly interested in, don't worry. Now, insects include anything that might be considered a bug, arachnids, scorpions, and all of that good stuff. They tend to be shown turgid, which is, again, is from above, but winged insects tend to be shown flying, volant en arrière. Okay, I got a question. Let's see. Fishtails or whale tails get added. Well, fishtails do get added to a variety of sea creatures. That's coming from Crystal League. The question is fishtails or whale tails. I don't think I've actually seen much in the way of whale tails, but fishtails, because they have scales and all of that, are really obviously a sea creature from that point. But yeah, And we will look at creating, when we look at monsters in the next lesson, there's going to be a whole section on sea monsters or sea creatures. But yeah, and basically one of the things I talk about there is that you can pretty much take almost any animal and tack a fish tail on it and call it a sea something. So, okay. Um, so with the insects, winged insects tend to be flying. Okay, that's how you can tell what they are, the position of the wings and all of that. So, okay. So let's see here. Most insects don't have a proper coloration simply because there's, in a lot of cases, you would, in order to get proper, you would have to be so specific for their breed. Where it does come up is with butterflies. If they are tinctured as found in nature, then you must specify a specific type of butterfly. And ladybug proper is gules spotted sable, and the legs are usually sable as well. But if you want it to be a green ladybug, you can do that. So there you go. Heraldry is pretty open-ended for a lot of this stuff. Now, images here mostly again from Bruce's site, again because Fox Davies didn't spend much time on them. Insects aren't used a lot in heraldry and period, but they do get used. So now, so we will see here a bee proper, which is argent and with argent wings. The upper body is or gold or so or yellow. The lower body is striped or in sable, and it is treated as a metal for the purpose of contrast. If you use it as proper, you can color it just sable and have a bee sable, and that would be fine. But if you wanted a bee proper, then it would be mostly metallic in color, and so you couldn't put it on a white field and so on. A butterfly proper, again, if you want it to be proper, you have to provide the breed of butterfly. Otherwise, you can blazon it like any other charge. You could call that a butterfly sable winged azure marked argent, which would give you blue wings with blue wings with white marking on the blue wings. So you can get fairly specific with the blazon on those, and that would be useful for the scribes. So. A dragonfly, we see those, and I know that there's at least one person up in Ortha who has dragonflies on her arms. You see them more in the SCA than you do in period armory, but there you go. Spiders can be defined as specific breeds. Black Widow would have the hourglass ghouls and so on. One thing I just thought was kind of amusing is, let's see, do I actually have that in here? No, I don't. Weird. Andrew of Riga at one time had a spider, was it Staten Combatant or something like that, which he thought was really funny because it has 8 legs. You can have 4 legs on the ground and 4 legs in a combatant position. But the College of Arms kept reblazoning it, and he eventually decided that it was no longer a joke, so he just got rid of it. Jellyfish, well, you don't really see them much in heraldry. And so I'm getting this from Revna. Basically, I don't really see jellyfish much in heraldry at all. I suppose you could probably do it, but they look kind of like a blob, even floating in the water. Although, obviously, if you've got them floating properly, then you're going to see the tentacles hanging off and so on. I don't really see them much in heraldry. I mean, you could probably do it. You might have to spend some time hunting it down, but yeah. I haven't looked to see if there's anything registered. I hadn't thought about it actually. So it's a good question though. So let's see here. And the scorpion, medieval mindset, vicious, treacherous. The whole story of the scorpion on the back of the fox or whatever animal and trying to cross a river and then the scorpion stinging it and dying and they both drowned. All of that fun stuff. But there you go. Scorpions are possible. Now, so that's pretty much it for the insects. And again, there's other insects out there. There are just not a lot of insects used in heraldry, especially in period heraldry. They're more used in SCA heraldry than in period. So moving on to reptiles and amphibians. So this is kind of basically anything that's cold-blooded. That really kind of falls into here. Most of them tend to be shown as turgient. So again, from above, snakes are the big exception there by default. Snakes can be defined as generic. There can be specific breeds, so you can have an adder, an asp, and so on. They have very specific postures, and we'll look at a couple of them in the next slide. So now, snakes can be called snakes or vipers. In period armory, you tend to see a lot of adders and asps. The SCA, you'll see cobras, rattlesnakes, a natural python. There is no default posture for a snake. So if somebody has a snake, you have to define the position. So a serpent erect is vertical, although notice that it's not a straight line because this is how they move. The body doing its little wavy bits. So there's a little bit of a wave. If the snake is horizontal, turning it the other direction, the head would be up. But other than that, it would be called glissant or gliding. So that would be the horizontal version. A snake naud is literally tied in a knot. That's what naud means in heraldry, is tied in a knot. So there you go. A serpent involved. There are a couple of different ways to do a serpent involved. This is a period form, which is what Bruce put up on his website. I couldn't find any examples easily, but think of a snake in a circle biting its tail. That's really what involved is for SCA usage. If you say a snake involved, it's going to be in a circle, and by default, it's going to be biting its tail. And that's how it works. You could actually just you could define it as simply a snake involved or a snake in annulo, and there you go. Now, a lizard statant. This is the default posture for a lizard. Now, Bruce notes that this is sometimes called a natural lizard because when we get to monsters, you'll see a salamander, which is quite literally a lizard that is engulfed in flames. There's flames all around it. Okay. This can also be a chameleon, and Bruce talks about giant lizards, the crocodiles, alligators, and we'll talk about dragon. Well, he talks about Komodo dragons, and we'll talk about actual dragons in the monsters part of all of this. So let's see a couple more questions. There's a question. Okay. So I see that there's a jellyfish or sea nettle. Okay, so this is Revna going back and looking at the jellyfish thing. Okay, well, I didn't hunt down jellyfish because I didn't think about them. So that's really where that goes. I'm sorry, they're so seldom used in heraldry. I didn't think about putting a picture of them up. Again, there's always more, right? So she's giving an example. There's actually somebody in the West. I assume you're working on a scroll for them or something. So let's see. And there's a picture of a snake in annulo. Okay. Okay. So yeah. So anyway, but yeah, for the jellyfish, like I say, if Bruce has got an example, that I would just go with that. Bruce is usually really good, and I will mention. I've mentioned this in an earlier lesson. Bruce is an SCA heraldic scholar who lives in Caid, and he's well known for his pictorial dictionary, which is now online, but used to be just a book. So let's see here. Snake on the bottom biting its tail. No scroll, just one eye. Okay. So Revna's just mentioning that she remembered seeing it. Okay. So that would be a snake involved. Yeah, the one with the snake biting its tail, yeah. Okay. So let's see here. Now, a tortoise. There's no difference between a tortoise or a turtle, although a natural sea tortoise would have flippers. But other than that. But they tend to be shown turgient because, again, from the side, they're a little more difficult. We do actually have some interesting cases, one out of Lockhawk of a turtle rampant, and I think it was maintaining a pole arm of some sort because at the time, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was real popular. So, welcome to the SCA, right? So a frog defaults to turgient. Again, it can also be a toad. And I do actually mention, just because a little bit of SCA trivia or West Kingdom trivia, although I think everybody here is in the West Kingdom, but there's an unofficial tournament in the West called La Crapaud, which is the French version of toad. So when you hear somebody state "Vive la Crapaud," they're stating "Long live the toad." And there's actually more to this. If you go to the West Kingdom history site and you look at traditions, there's a description of the Crapaud tournament and where it came from and why the term Crapaud is being used and so on. But anyway, I thought it was just kind of a fun little bit, is that these folks have used that for actually a position of some honor for those who actually win the tourney. They're considered to be somebody who did really well in that day. So anyway, this is the last of the slides dealing with creatures. The last part of the lesson is going to be dealing with flora, so trees and flowers and all that. So I just wanted to mention. So like again, there is so much out there that I can't possibly put it all into a single lesson or even multiple lessons. We could spend a huge amount of time just on the stuff I've covered today. I could have done a whole lesson just on these, but I wanted to not do everything because it's just not possible to really, do it well. So that I'm going to move on, and we're going to start looking at trees. So everybody knows trees. We got them everywhere. This is California. Trees are everywhere. When trees are blazoned as proper, it is brown. It has green leaves. Okay, now there are going to be exceptions. If you have a maple tree, the odds are, depending on a lot of things, it could have red leaves, especially if it's a Japanese maple, that kind of thing. But by default, a tree proper is brown with green leaves. Okay. Trees don't have postures, and if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. A tree is a tree is a tree. You don't have a tree rampant, and all of that. Now, for an April Fool's joke, that might be kind of fun, but a tree that is bearing fruit, which can include nuts, is called fructed. Okay, and the tincture of the fruit may be specified. So and we'll take a look at an orange tree in a moment that has oranges on it. Now, if you have fruit on a tree or you have leaves on a tree, they tend to be drawn larger in relationship to the size of the tree itself so that you can see what they are. Otherwise, you can't tell what you're looking at. Little itty-bitty tiny things on a device. So the most common form of tree in heraldry is the oak tree. And for California, that's great. That's why the Kingdom of the West uses the oak for things. That's why riven oak uses it and so on. Okay. Trees are often grouped into two primary categories, round-shaped and pointy-shaped. It's kind of a gross generalization in some ways, but it does help when you're comparing for the purpose of heraldic conflict and so on, which we'll talk about in the last lesson. But anyway, so trees that are cut off in a straight horizontal line are cooped. If they show their roots, they are eradicated. If they are showing branches with no leaves or fruit, the tree is blasted, and you can combine these last two and have a tree blasted and eradicated. We'll take a look at that. So, okay, so some beginning stuff with trees. So Fox Davies doesn't give a lot of examples. Some tree types are used very specifically for canting. So, example, we'll have the rowan tree, which could be used for somebody whose family name is Rowan, that kind of thing. So. Now, an oak tree, one of the oldest examples, they are round-shaped and they have acorns. And in both examples, now the one on the left, which is from Bruce's site, the acorns are actually a little smaller. But if you look at the one that has the number, which is an oak tree eradicated, you will see that the leaves and the acorns are actually a little larger than they would be on an actual tree. And again, that's because how can you tell from a distance that those are acorns, right? So the idea is you make them larger. So now, the orange tree by default shows the fruit, but if you want to color the oranges orange, you would have to state an orange tree fructed orange, which is not a normal color in heraldry, but for the purpose of getting them correct for calling them oranges, that would be okay. But you tend to use the word fructed for that. So now two of these are eradicated. So again, they're showing you the roots of the tree. The pine tree that is shown here is cooped, and this is a pointy tree, obviously. So it's cut off. So if you look at the oak tree on the far left, you will see it's growing out of the ground. You're not giving it a line at the bottom. You're just kind of making it look like it's growing out of the shield, as it were. Where the pine tree cooped is actually cut off. Okay, so and you can do that for any tree. So the next image is a palm tree, which is also cooped. The willow tree defaults to a white willow. If you want to use a weeping willow, you have to define it as part of the blazon. So if you simply say a willow, you'll get what you're seeing here or something like it. If you want to use a weeping willow that has the branches coming all the way down to the ground and all of that, then you have to define it very specifically as a weeping willow. Now, the poplar tree is considered to be a step from core practice, and we'll talk about that in more detail in the last lesson, but it's not something that we found many examples in, period. Okay, so it's more, you see it more in SCA, but you don't see it all that often. But you're going to see it more in SCA usage. Now, some other stuff with trees. So here we have a generic tree, and it is blasted and eradicated. So again, the term blasted is talking about the branches at the top of the tree, and there are no leaves and no fruit on them. And eradicated means it's showing you the roots, and again, you can use one or the other or both. Now, here's an interesting one. This is a crequier, which is a very stylized depiction of a cherry tree, which I would never guess if I just simply saw the term. Okay. So there's some interesting ones, and I didn't find much explanation for why. It's just, that's what it is. Now, we also have a rose bush, and again, notice the size of the roses compared to the actual limbs and so on. This is, again, very typical. It's to make sure that you can actually see the roses, and you can tell what they are. And the same thing for the leaves. The leaves are very carefully defined and fairly large compared to the branches. So a group of trees is called a Hirsch, and the number of trees is often artistic license. This is just what Bruce shows is 3 of them. I've seen them with 5 or 7 trees. It's really more artistic license. You could probably define it as a Hirsch of 7 trees, or be more specific if that was important to you for some reason. The last image is a tree stump eradicated. The top of a tree stump tends to be cooped. And there's a bit more detail. Bruce put some more information up on his website talking about this in more depth. But anyway, so there's that. So let's see. That's the main parts on the tree. So yeah, we can use for your armory, you can use tree parts, and that can be leaves, it can be limbs, which are sometimes called slips. So a slip is sometimes called a branch, same thing. It can have fruit, so again, you would call it fructed if it has fruit on it. Flowers and fruit are sometimes slipped as well, and we'll take a look at that in just a moment. So these first 2 examples, we have a slip with leaves. There's no specific type involved here for that particular one. It's kind of a generic tree branch with some leaves on it. If you wanted to be specific, again, you could. You could have an oak tree, a slip of an oak tree leaved, yeah, and you could even call the tinctures and so on. The next one is a linden branch twined on itself, and I don't know why Bruce chose to put that in, but because it's not a very common thing to do, but why not, right? Lots of interesting things you can do here. We have a pair of grapevines that are entwined, and they are throughout, meaning that they go to the edge of the shield. So throughout is actually touching the edge. Okay, so anytime you see a charge defined as throughout, it's always touching the edge of the shield. Okay. Now, leaves can be generic, and they can be specified to ensure a specific shape is given. So you can have a linden leaf, an oak leaf, an ivy leaf, a holly leaf, and so on. There's a lot of different things. As a matter of fact, the College of Arms just in the last letter of acceptances and returns, LOAR, actually defined, and I put this in the notes. I'm not going to go over all the detail because it's complicated, but it actually breaks down leaves into different types, into different shapes. So you get leaf-shaped, heart-shaped, maple-shaped, And the idea is if you're comparing them for the purpose of heraldic conflict, different types don't always conflict with each other. So it gets a little complicated. So anyway, but I put some of those details in the notes for this slide if you're really interested in pursuing anything to do with that. So let's see here. Okay. So, and the last two on the right are really fascinating, and I really kind of like them. I don't use them in my arms myself, but I think they're really kind of cool looking. You have what is called a Zablot, which is a water lily leaf, which is the first one. If you use more than one, it's Zablotter, which is, again, you're using the German for that. You would call it 3 Zablotter. And the Nesselblot is a highly stylized form of a nettle leaf. This is not a Borger. It's easy to see how somebody might confuse it as a Borger, but the leaf is actually the center part of all that. Okay. When drawn on different shapes, it should keep this shape, although when I was doing my research on this, this is a fun one. When I was doing my research, I actually found in Neubecker, which is the German and Continental, one of the German and Continental books on heraldry, he actually shows a couple of cases where the Nesselblot follows the shape of a rectangular banner and so on, which is a little weird considering they're supposed to be a specific charge. But I'm in the SCA, we tend to assume that the Nesselblot will be that shape. And you can have multiple Nesselblot, so you could have 3 Nesselblotter on a device if you wanted to. But anyway, I kind of like them. It's just as a fascinating charge. It's just an interesting shape. So for both of them. Okay, so flowers. Now, flowers is a fairly large category because, well, there's a lot of different types of flowers out there, and many of them show up in heraldry. So they are usually shown a fronty, which is meaning you're seeing the flower from the front. Because again, a lot of flowers you can't really tell what they are from the side. There are a few cases where they do show that way, and they're broken down into some groups. So flowers known to period Europeans and other cultures covered by the SCA should be allowable. So if there's a flower, if you're doing a Japanese persona and you want a flower that's a Japanese flower that wasn't known in Europe, you could probably use it. I won't guarantee it, but it should be allowable. Okay. But that's as far as I'm going to go with that because I am not an expert on everything because everything's changing within the SCA for how the cultures work. So now flowers can have slips and leaves, which means, again, a branch, and they can have leaves off of them. They tend to be both slipped and leaved or simply slipped. Sometimes you'll see a flower that's leaved without the slips, but that's kind of unusual. And flowers like roses also have seeds and barbs, and they can often be tinctured differently from the rest of the flower. So lots of interesting stuff here. So now, I'm not going to be able to cover every single possible permutation or flower type. Now, a lot of the images here are from Bruce again. The ones from Fox Davies have numbers. So we have the standard heraldic rose. Now, a heraldic rose is a very specific design, and you'll see it has 5 petals. It has the seeds in the center. It has the barbs, which are coming out between the petals at the edges there. You can have a rose slipped and leaved. And on the 4th image there, you will see a garden rose slipped and leaved, which you can use, but you cannot use any longer a rosebud slipped and leaved, or a rosebud at all. And that's because a rosebud is not really something that was ever done in period heraldry, where a garden rose looks enough like a heraldic rose that it's not too far of a stretch to allow it. But there you go. Now, Bruce also notes a couple of variations on the rose of a Kendall flower, which was used for the family up in Ontario, the Kendalls. They're no longer with us, and they actually, after the last person registered one, they're no longer allowed unless you are a member of that family. There's also one called a Mamluk rose, and I can't remember what that looks like, but it doesn't really look much like a rose. Anyway, roses, when proper, are gules, seeded ore, which means the center part is ore, and they are barbed, which again, those little bits coming between the petals, boy, I'm doing good today, are green. Okay. Now, you can also define those very specifically if you want to. So now, shown here, you can't use this. This is called a Tudor rose. This is combining the badge of the House of York and the House of Lancaster, forming the Tudor badge. You can't have a crowned rose, which is an English royal badge. And you can't have any permutation of a red rose and a white rose. One example is half red and half white. You can't do that. You could have half red and half blue, but you couldn't have half red and half white. And that's because, again, these are very, very carefully reserved because of the associations with British history. The rose en soleil is kind of a fascinating chart. It's literally a rose on top of a sun. Now, you can't have this particular version because this is, again, it's the badge of the House of Lancaster, which is Edward IV. It's protected. However, you can do a different tincture rose. Okay, you could even actually, I mentioned here the SCA protects a rose gules en soleil, but then I found a couple of registrations that were a red rose en soleil. So I guess it's possible, I just didn't fix that slide. So it is possible that you can get away with that. So it's kind of an interesting thing. You can also use en soleil for some other charges. While I was looking at en soleil, I found a book en soleil. So a book with on top of the sun, like kind of an interesting combination. Now, some other flower types, just again to give you some examples, some ideas. The gillyflower, very stylized flower. It can be displayed with a stem or without the stem. This one is shown slipped and leaved. Let's see, the irises. They're not found in period armory, so there's no stylized version. We'll come back to something which some of you, if you know enough about this, you might actually know what I'm going to do. But anyway, the lily is also a stylized flower. I know that in Owertha and Wintersgate, there's the Order of the Gilded Lily, which is for arts and sciences up in the barony of Wintersgate. I know because I helped create that award. Let's see, and then there's the fleur-de-lis. So the fleur-de-lis is a stylized form of the iris or the lily flower. So when I state there's no stylized version, I'm talking about something that's more stylized, like the way that you see the lily that's shown here. That's a stylized form of the lily flower. So anyway, but the fleur-de-lis, these are just a few examples of what a fleur-de-lis can look like. There is no SCA standard or default image for a fleur-de-lis. If you go looking around in a wide range of books, you will find a wide range of forms of the fleur-de-lis. They will look very similar. They will all be recognizable as a fleur-de-lis, but they can look different. Even the three images from Child here look a bit different from each other. You know, they're just different ways of drawing the fleur-de-lis. This is where we get into that whole artistic license thing, right? So now, the lotus, this is fun, is a cup-shaped flower. There are two images. The first one shows it up fronty, and the other one shows it in profile. They're both unique enough in appearance that you can get away with that, where with a lot of flowers, you couldn't really show them in profile. There are some, but a lot of flowers you can't. So thistles are fun. And the reason I mention that they're fun is because when the SCA was evolving, it started here in California, as most of you know, but the bloom of the thistle was defined as proper and based off of the California thistle, which has a purple bloom, which is the very top tuft at the top of the thistle there. But in period armory, it was based off of Scottish thistles, which have a red bloom on top. So you could do a thistle proper and have a red bloom on top, but you would have to define it as a Scottish thistle or as a thistle vert bloomed gules or whatever to get the red on top. Odd little things that happened over time, right? Okay, now the columbine is trumpet shaped, and this one you can get away with showing in profile because from the front it might not look anything like something that was recognizable. When it's proper, the petals are blue. The daisy is multi-petaled. It can be called a marguerite for the purpose of canting. And when it's proper, it is gold with, oh no, I'm sorry, it's argent or silver with seeds in the center being gold. So again, that could then be placed on any of the tinctures and just by calling it proper. An Edelweiss, again, is argent seeded ore, and it has kind of a distinct appearance. So again, it's very different from a daisy and so on. Okay, now this is a fun one. There's a group of flowers called foils. Okay, and I put them on their own slide simply because they are different enough from everything else that I wanted to talk about them. And they're called a foil, but there's a specific term for the number of petals on the flower. So you have a trefoil, which has 3 petals. By default, this one has a stem where it's slipped. If you don't want it to be slipped, I don't know if there's a term for that, actually. It defaults to being slipped, so I'm not real sure if you could state without a slip or something. But anyway, you also see a shamrock, so the shape of the petals is a little different. Let's see, the quatrefoil, and there's also a cinquefoil on the same image here. But a quatrefoil has 4 petals, and it can be called a 4-leaf clover if you wanted to. Okay. You have a cinquefoil, which has 5 petals, and typically one of those 5 petals is at the top, which helps keep it in an orientation. This is sometimes called a fraise or a strawberry flower for the purpose, again, of canting. Okay. 6 foils or sexfoil, I've seen it both as 6-foil or sexfoil, has 6 petals. And octafoil is 8 petals. And I took these 2 off of different websites, which I couldn't find after I pulled the images, which is really stupid. But when you're searching the web, sometimes something gets lost, and the way the page displays when you look again is not what you were looking at before. But anyway, so I don't actually have the URLs for where I pulled those from, but it's okay. I would cite them if I could find the page again. Okay, so those are the foils. It is possible to do more with foils, but it gets a little crazy after a while. So, a polyfoil? No, it's not a polyfoil. Thanks. Okay. So, fruit includes nuts. So sometimes you feel like a nut, right? So there we go. There's my stupid joke for the slide. Not everything you can register is shown, of course, because again, there's kind of a wide open field here. And some of the things that are going to be shown here don't really fall under nuts and fruit, but they fall into something kind of vaguely related. Anyway, so come on, here we go. Any fruit known in cultures, again, covered by the SCA, should be acceptable. You may have to do a little documentation if you want to use something that's not commonly used in SCA heraldry. So we have the acorn, pretty common. You see them in heraldry a lot. They're used for some of the awards that are given in the West Kingdom. What's interesting here is that period form, if it tends to show the acorn upside down, or what looks to us as upside down. It has the stem to base. And then one that's shown here from Fox Davies is slipped in leaves. So it's giving you the very obvious oak tree leaves and so on. An acorn that's an SCA default shows the stem to chief. So we have 2 different ways of doing that. You can invert those, or you could define it as an acorn stem to base if you wanted to have the stem to base. So we have an apple, and an apple goes the same way. It has the exact same orientation as the acorn. So it defaults to slipped and leaved. In this case, up the top of the apple is showing in this orientation. A clove. So again, I mentioned that there's some things that aren't really fruit or nuts, but they kind of fall into this category. Is the dried flower bud of the clove tree. If it's proper, it is a dark brown. And Bruce chose to put a Japanese clove or a choji in here, which apparently is found in some Japanese mon, although not so much in period Japanese mon, which is Japanese heraldry, but they are considered to be acceptable for use in SCA heraldry. There's not a whole lot of difference in appearance between the two, but there you go. You can have a garlic bulb. Okay. A garlic clove you can't really, just kind of looks like this thing. Anyway, you can have an ear of wheat, which is grain. You can also have stalks of wheat. You can have an ear of something else. There's different types of grains that you could use. You can have a garb or a sheaf, which is a bundle of whatever grain it happens to be. This one is wheat, I think. But anyway, they tend to default to wheat. But again, you can have a garb of a group of a bunch of stems of whatever grain it happens to be. They're tied to keep them all together. Okay, so again, by default, they tend to be wheat. So some other fruit and nuts, a bunch of grapes, and this one happens to be slipped and leaved. They typically are shown with a slip to chief. If they're proper, they tend to be pure. The leek. It's the unofficial plant badge of Wales, which was made really famous in Henry V. If you're familiar with the play or the movie versions of the play and so on, there's that whole bit with Henry talking to Llewellyn about I have been known to wear the leek. So it is pale-wise by default, and the bulb is to base. The mushroom tends to be cooped, and if you want a very specific type of mushroom, you have to blazon. You have to give the specific genus and all of that fun stuff. The pomegranate is shown with the bulb split so that you can see the seeds. Otherwise, it could be some other round fruit. Okay. Basically, there is no real proper. It's kind of difficult because, as Bruce mentions, real world and SCA blazons have been inconsistent for the definition of proper. So if you're going to use a pomegranate, it's probably a good idea to blazon it very specifically. You can call it, ore, seeded, ghouls, slipped and leaf, vert, whatever, just to give you the colors that would make the most sense to you. A pine cone was sometimes called a pineapple in period. So that makes it interesting because when we suddenly discovered pineapples, as we call them, which in SCA heraldry would be called a New World pineapple, they look obviously very different from each other, but you can see how somebody who was used to pine cones being called pineapples and saw the pineapple that we see here, you can see how they might confuse the two if they were looking at it from a distance or something. The New World pineapple is considered to be a step from core practice because they weren't really used much if at all, in period heraldry. So, okay, and the last slide here is going to be dealing with wreaths, and this actually includes some cloth wreaths because they all kind of fit into the same category. So, a torse is shown in annulo or in a circle, and if it has two different colors, you have to define both. So my example on the slide here, I actually state a torse, vert, and or. It's not actually colored, obviously, but if you were going to do that, that was what you would need to do, is define the colors. A laurel wreath reserved for branches of the SCA, and those of us who are members of the Order of the Laurel are kind of like, hey, but there you go. We can't use them either, so there you go. A chaplet is used to denote a circle of foliage, and it can also be called a wreath. So a chaplet of roses or a wreath of roses. Let's see, and I do actually talk about that. Let me see, did I put anything in my notes on that? The wreath of roses is, I don't actually have anything in the notes. The one thing about a wreath of roses is that if it is a wreath of roses red, well, actually, a wreath of roses is really kind of defined for countesses or members of the Order of the Rose, I should say. Let me call it members of the Order of the Rose, because who knows, at some point we will have a male member of the Order of the Rose. But people who have reigned as, the consort in a kingdom. Okay. But anyway, you have chaplet of thorns. Here we have a German and an English chaplet of roses. The Jocelyn is a torse that has hawk's bells, and I don't know why it's called a Jocelyn. I couldn't find that. And I mentioned here rose wreaths. I thought I mentioned that. They're reserved to the arms of queens, princesses, and so on, and royal peers, so people who have reigned. Okay. So I wanted to make sure I covered those because some of them are plant-based and some of them aren't, but there we go. So those are the reads. And we're at the end of the lesson. So if anybody's got questions that we didn't get to before, this would be the place for it. So I thought I'd open things up. Anyone? Did I answer the questions? Everybody still awake?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was trying to get my phone to unmute.
Oh, no, it's okay. I'm just...
Are there heraldic rocks? Because like
heraldic.
I've only seen one, and I think it's actually a mountain.
Yeah. Yeah, rocks are not really commonly used in heraldry. You will see a mountain, but yeah, I would imagine you could probably call it a piece of granite or a granite rock or something if you wanted it to be a very specific type of rock, obsidian or something like that. But I don't know. I don't think I've ever seen that used. But I suppose it's possible.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
Thanks.
kind of an interesting question though. But yeah, mountains are used. They're actually usually a base that is very specifically defined as a mountain. So.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Okay. Well, that went. Let me see how long I took. Wow, that actually went a little longer than I thought it would. I wasn't sure. Evergreen trees. Well, yeah, basically, no, you can vary. The question is about evergreen trees having more variation than just pine. Yeah, basically, they're lumped into pointy trees, but you can have other trees that are basically fall into the pointy tree category. You can have a fir. You can have for the purpose of conflict, they wouldn't, basically a pointy shaped tree would conflict with another pointy shaped tree if you were dealing with, comparing two coats of arms. But other than that, yeah, you could define a tree as a very specific type of evergreen if that's what you needed to do, or if it was something that was very important to you. Yeah, sure. So one of the things that's fun about heraldry is that if there's something that's very specific to you, that is very important to you, you can put it in the blazon and you can request that it be kept as part of the blazon. And sometimes the College of Arms will go, yeah, but, and then we'll take it out. But you can also make sure that you have notes, and if it's drawn properly and it's up where the scribes can see it, they can look at what your preference is and use it from there. And the scribes really like being able to do that. And Jocelyn could be related to Jess's on birds. Yeah, it could, and I'm sure that's probably where the idea came from. Actually, it may have also come from, I've forgotten the type of dance, but there's a type of dance, Morris dancing, where they actually have bells on their ankles and they dance, and they have them on their wrists and so on, and they shake them as they're dancing. That might also be where the Jocelyn came from. I'm not quite sure, but I mean, it's completely possible. Yeah. Like I said, I couldn't find anything, but that doesn't mean it's not there. I just may have looked past it, because there's a lot of information out there. Okay, so let me. Okay, so the next lesson is going to be starting with monsters, which is a topic lots of people love, and I know at least one person had asked about dragons in the last lesson. And we're then going to look at inanimate objects, and inanimate objects is a huge category. So I'm not going to try to cover every single thing that you can do with inanimate objects, but I'm going to try to cover a pretty good amount. Partially because there's a lot of ways you can group some of them, and so I'm going to talk about them in groups. Then I'm going to throw a bunch of just random inanimate charges up on the screen and talk about them. So there's that. And then, like always, monsters are done separately. Part of the reason I wanted to do the monsters separately is because many of the monsters are combined from other creatures. So you're taking the wings of an eagle and attaching them to a stag, for example. So you'd have a winged stag, things like that. And then there's specific monster types that are very carefully crafted by pulling different parts of different monsters. So a griffin has an eagle's head, and it has a lion's body, and it has an eagle's wings, and so on. So they're very carefully put together, and it's actually got a name, which is a griffin. So I wanted to cover all the other creatures before I got to the monsters, so you could see how all that comes together. So anyway, Inanimate objects covers pretty much everything else. So basically, the next lesson will be the last lesson talking about the charges, and then the final lesson will be about putting everything together. So we'll be talking about some of the rules and how things work, and some very interesting things that you can do that I haven't covered elsewhere, that kind of thing. So there we go. And the resources used, and again, so I give you, and this is on every one of these, it's going to be a slightly different list on the lessons, but these are the resources I use for this particular lesson. And there you go. So hopefully I will see at least many of you in 2 weeks. That will be when the next lesson is. So there we go. And we can probably stop the recording at this point.